All right, we're ready for 142, 143, and 144 in the Psalms. We have two more classes. Next week we will get 145, 146, and 147. And then we'll get 148, 149, and 150 in the last week, and that'll bring this to a close. We'll say more later what we will be doing on Wednesday night for the rest of the year. But two more classes on Psalms. We are, as we've mentioned each time, in the fifth book of the Psalms, which is the last one, starting with 107 to 150. And that's where we are and where we will be till we are done. So let's talk about Psalm 142. What type of psalm do we have? It is a prayer. It is a psalm, well, I'll say more about that in a moment. The author, David, though questioned by some, and you may wonder why, and that has to do with textual questions of the Hebrew versus the Septuagint translation versus some other early translations, and some wording that is used in all three of these psalms. Some argue are late words that were not used early, and therefore it could not be David. This is taken from the Hebrew text. That is, the author line is taken from what the translators thought to be the most reliable Hebrew text, and consequently we take it to be David. Message of Psalm 142, point. It is a cry for help, right in the midst of trouble. So I simply call it a prayer for help in time of trouble. All three of these psalms, particularly the first two tonight, are going to be psalms that we all, in fact every psalm this is true of, but I think these psalms are very practical from the vantage point. We can identify in some shape, form, or fashion. We may not be going through the identical problem, we are not, and probably never will. But we may be going through some problems that we think are comparable to what the psalmist has gone through. So, let's talk about this psalm. There are two things in the psalm. There is the danger and there is the plea for deliverance from the danger. The title that was given to the psalm in the Hebrew text is a contemplation of David when he was in the cave. And as with any aspect of the text, that's questioned by some. Did he literally mean in a cave, or did he mean he was like living, or he was going through something like being in a cave? I take it that he was in a cave because he was in a cave on two occasions. For what it's worth to you, let's go back to 1 Samuel 22 if you want to get a reference to this. And you may have some notes at 1 Samuel 22 as I have. That this is likely the place where it fits. It may not be. It may be another occasion that we'll mention in just a moment. He was at the cave of Adullam in 1 Samuel 22. And you'll see that mentioned in verse 1 that he escaped to the cave of Adullam. And his brothers went with him and some family went with him. I have a marginal note from our own purpose, and you may have one when we were coming through that Psalm 142 was written here, most likely. Is that 100% that this is the time? No, there's another possible occasion. But also Psalm 57 is thought to have been written here at this point. Now, I'll tell you about another occasion in just a moment, but was it written while he was in the cave? Likely after he came out of the cave. But I'm not going to argue over that, whether he was in the cave, and while he was in the cave, did he take time to write the psalm, or did he write the psalm later about the occasion of being in the cave? I think the latter probably is the case. The other possibility is 1 Samuel 24, when he was at the cave of En-gedi in 1 Samuel chapter 24. But most think that it's probably the first occasion in 1 Samuel 22. So you take your choice, and if you think you feel strongly about one more than the other, then stick with that. I'm not going to argue one way or the other. I think probably the first is at least the one that's the most commonly accepted. All right. With that in mind, he is in trouble. He is fleeing as he flees from Saul, and he's fleeing for his own safety. He is indeed in trouble, if this be the occasion. And so there is danger. And there is this plea for deliverance, and there's some very practical things to be learned from that. I want to get ahead of myself to suggest that verses 1 to 4 focuses on the danger, and 5 to 7 focuses on the plea for deliverance. I like what J. Sidlow Baxter said. I put J. Sidlow Baxter. That's W. Graham Scroggie, I think, is where I got this. I don't know why I put Baxter, but nonetheless, that he suggests that what happens here in these two sections, that the one section is focusing on his position, where the next section focuses on his petition. The first focuses on his trouble. Here it focuses on his trust. The first 4 verses focus on his condition. The second section focuses on his confidence. He's making a play on words, obviously. He focuses in the first on his desertion, where the next section focuses on his deliverance, his complaint in verses 1 to 4, his consolation in 5 to 7, his dejection in 1 to 4, and 5 to 7, his delight. And that is the case. We'll say more about those contrasts in a moment. All right, let's look at the first 4 verses and his danger. 2 things that he has here. He first talks about taking his complaint to God. The idea of a complaint in the Psalms, I don't think the word means as we think of a person complaining. If we talk about someone who is a complaining person, who complains and grumbles and gripes, but it is simply a vocal expression of inward trouble. That I'm experiencing inward trouble, consternation, or some of these expressions. I'm going through a desertion. I feel dejected. I am in trouble, and it is expressing that and expressing that trouble that's called a complaint. Does that make sense? Not so much that he's complaining, but anyway, let's look at this complaint. First of all, in verses 1 and 2, he takes his complaint to God. And that's interesting. That's the reaction always with the psalmist, that he takes his complaint to God. So what do you see in verses 1 and 2? He tells God about his trouble, absolutely. I cry out to the Lord with my voice. I make my supplication with my voice to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare before him my trouble. We'll say more about those words in a moment. I don't think he's telling God the problem because God needs to know about the problem. God already knows about the problem. Several commentators make the observation that this is part of his grasping with the problem, is just expressing it and telling, as you tell a problem to someone else. Forget God for a moment. If you just tell your problems to someone else, that's part of the therapy of just expressing your problem. And he expresses to God, this is the trouble and the problem that I have. More about that in a moment. Now in verses 3 and 4, here is his complaint. What is his complaint?
Because of what they're doing, his faith has become weaker, I guess. Not weak, but trouble.
All right, yeah, there is trouble. Look at verse 3. That my spirit was overwhelmed. In other words, he's down. I feel overwhelmed. He's run to this cave and fleeing for his safety. I feel overwhelmed. Then you knew my path and which way I would walk. We'll say more about that in a moment. God knows his way. I take that, and well, notice further that he said, they have secretly set a snare for me. What does that suggest? That's right, set a trap. Saul is out to kill him. Saul is trying to set a trap. Saul is trying to ensnare him somehow. And so the point is, God knows the way. That I'm dealing with one. I'm taking my complaint to God, who knows my past. He knows my future. He understands fully this snare that is being set before me. And so I'm taking my complaint to God. More about that in a moment on another slide here in just a second. He looks to his right hand and he sees what? No one is there to even acknowledge him and refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul. And so he said, this is my complaint. I'm in danger, and it seems like nobody cares. Now, I don't think that's an absolute nobody cares about me. How would I know that? I just mentioned a moment ago in another text. Adullam.
Then his father, his brothers, and many from the poor and those that were less off were there with him.
Yes. There were several went with him into the cave, as the text shows in 1 Samuel 22, if that's the occasion. And so he had family there with him. So it is not an absolute, there is no one, not a single person cares. But the majority, what he feels like is the world is against him. The king is against him. The whole army is against him. And comparatively, very small number of people even care about him. And so no one cares about me. No one is interested. More about that here. We'll tie some of that together. Let's go to 5 to 7. So now here is his plea. And so he says, I cried out to the Lord, you are my refuge. What does that mean? What's the word refuge mean? Protection. His protection, his shelter. You're the one I run to for safety. Now he ran into the cave, but really the cave is not his protection. What he's saying is God is my protection, my portion of the living. So attend to my cry, for I'm brought very low. I feel like I'm at a low spot and a low point in my life. They are stronger, deliver me. And then what's he going to do? Verse 7. Bring my soul out of prison, that he may give praise to his name. That's his for. May I escape from this, not so I can fight another war. May I escape from this, not so that I can go live with my family. May I escape from this so that I might praise your name. What does that tell you about David? That his priority is right. His focal point was praising God, and not merely the salvation of his life. And then he says, notice this is quite a change from verse 4. What do you see at the end of verse 7? I will be surrounded by the righteous, for you deal bountifully with me. He's confident. I'll come back to that righteous in just a second. But notice the confidence he had in the Lord, for you deal bountifully with me. So David is writing, whether he writes it while he's in the cave, he's writing as if this was the vantage point of while he's in the cave, if he wrote it later. And the point is that while he has fled from Saul, he's run for safety into the cave, he's confident the Lord will deliver him. The Lord's going to hear my cry, the Lord's going to hear my complaint, and the Lord will answer me. Confidence in the Lord. Now, we've already noticed that contrast from Scroggie. But I want to go back and look at it from this vantage point rather than the outline. I want to list the problems and see if you can't relate to this somehow. Perhaps there's a point in your life that you may be going through some struggle. You're not fleeing where somebody's trying to kill you, so you're not to the extreme David was. But there may be a struggle going on. It may be with health. It may be with family problems. It may be spiritual struggles. It may be children gone astray. Whatever it may be, you're going through some struggle, and you may feel this way. You may feel you have trouble. You may feel like you're overwhelmed. You ever feel like you're just overwhelmed? I don't know where I'm going to turn next. I don't know what I can do next. I don't think I can take another ounce of the burden. It's just going to get me completely down. You may feel like people are out to get you. David felt like they're out to get me. They set a snare for me. You may feel like no one cares. Elijah felt that way, and Elijah was wrong. Remember that? God said, there are yet how many? 7,000 have not bowed their knee to Baal. You may feel like this is the lowest point I've ever been. You may feel like you're being persecuted. You may feel like, I really feel like I'm in prison is what I feel like. Well, here is the comfort that he gets by telling my complaint. As I mentioned a moment ago, Leupold develops this thought. Scroggie develops this thought. Others develop this thought that his expression of his complaint to God is part of the healing process or dealing with that. I'm just telling God God already knows my problems and he knows my trouble, but my telling him helps me to grapple with that problem. And so that's part of the comfort he has. Knowing God knows my way. That should say my way instead of my way. God knows my way. He knows where I've been. He knows what's going to happen in the future. And He knows the traps and the snares that are set before me. He knows the trouble I'm in. That's comforting. You ever tell somebody your troubles, but you're not sure they understood your troubles? God does. And then he says God cares. Look at verses 3 to 5. Where he said it doesn't seem like they care, and yet I call out to the Lord. He's my refuge. See, I call out to you because you do care. No one else seems to care, but you do care. And God is my shelter. And then at verse 7, righteous people will support me. Leupold develops the thought, and I think makes a good point, that it seems the psalm starts on the note, no one seems to care, but before he gets through, there are people who care, my God, and righteous people care, and what else really matters? Does that make sense? Kind of a transformation the psalmist went through, like Psalm 55 was a transformation psalm. All right, anything else on Psalm 142? Absolutely. God already knew that. One writer said at verse 5, when God is my portion in the land of the living, that all is well if the world is against me, because I have got the Lord. Good point. The whole world can be against us, but the Lord is my shelter. And so the whole world may be chaotic, but the Lord is my shelter. We need to be reminded of that. Questions, comments? He's still on his throne. Good point. Practical things you learned from this psalm before we go to Psalm 143. Take home with you. All right, good point. If he's going to be doing the things of praising his name, he will be among the righteous, is one thing for sure. Especially if he's out of this prison, as he calls it. Much discussion among some commentators, the term prison here, whether was he alluding to some literal prison or is he viewing the cave as a prison? I think that's a lot of discussion about nothing. I think he's viewing the cave as a prison, rather than being in a literal prison. I see no evidence of that.
Peter was in a literal prison, but when he was let out by the angel, he went to a house where people were praying for him. The righteous were surrounded him even when they weren't physically there.
Good point. Good point. And while he was in prison, they were praying for him earlier in that chapter, Acts 12. All right, let's go to Psalm 143 now. What type of psalm do we have? It is another prayer. The author is David, and the point. All right, it is an appeal for guidance and deliverance. I simply call the psalm a prayer for help in a time of trouble. Very similar to the previous psalm. Different occasion, but a very similar occasion. He was fleeing, apparently, Psalm 142, from Saul. This one likely is from Absalom. Now, there's nothing said about Absalom directly in the psalm. So where do we get the idea? The Septuagint heading. Now remember, the Septuagint is the Greek translation out of the Hebrew text. It was a translation our Lord used, the apostles used. But the heading that the translators gave to this was that this was at the time he fled from Absalom. Is that the case? Don't know for sure. But it would seem to well fit that occasion. He seems to be in trouble again. David is the author. He again is in trouble. He's fleeing from some trouble. There is some enemy that is persecuting him, and consequently he is making a plea for God's mercy. So again, two things. happen in the psalm, the complaint and the plea for mercy. Scroggie calls this psalm, his title to this psalm is Deep Distress. And sometimes we may feel like we're in deep distress, as we just mentioned a moment ago. All right, let's work through this psalm here. Let's look at the first 6 verses. First of all, he makes an appeal to God's justice. So let's see what he says in verses 1 and 2. We'll do the same thing we did with the last psalm. We'll come and look at the problem and his response to the problem a little bit later. But anyway, look at verse 1. Hear my prayer. First of all, he takes his complaint to the Lord. Hear my supplication. In your faithfulness, answer me in your righteousness. Your translation may say, and in your righteousness, but and has been supplied. And so it seems to be an appeal to the justice of God. You are a faithful God, you are a true God, and you are a righteous God. So answer me in light of that. If God is a righteous God, then he's going to vindicate the righteous. Does that make sense? Now that wording is not found there. In other words, God will vindicate the righteous. So where did I get the idea that God's going to vindicate the righteous? Because I think I can take those first 2 verses and teach a doctrine, God will vindicate the righteous. Where did I get that idea from those verses? Or can I take those? We all agree that's a true principle, but is that a misuse of this text? All right. If he promises in other places, then if he's faithful, he'll do that. If he's a just God, then he will vindicate ultimately the righteous, and he'll ultimately punish the wicked, will he not? Or he's not a righteous God. In other words, if God sets a law and men violate it and they pay no price, and men obey the law and they have no reward, then he's not a righteous God. So he makes an appeal to the righteousness of God. Now, in verse 2 has caused much consternation among students, and that is, do not enter into judgment with your servant, for in your sight no one living is righteous. I don't think it is in the context of making an appeal to the justice of God. Do we want to make an appeal to the justice of God? Yes. But when I make an appeal to God for God to be just, I also want to make an appeal for God to show his mercy. Absolutely. Because if God is just totally just without mercy, then guess what? Yeah, we don't stand a chance. So that's what the psalmist is saying. Vindicate, if I might paraphrase verses 1 and 2, I appeal to your faithfulness and your righteousness to vindicate the righteous, please. But in your justice, have mercy on your servants. Me, for example, David is saying. For no one is righteous in your sight. I think that's a comparison. I don't think he's saying no one is righteous, because if that's the case, then let's go back to the previous psalm. The righteous shall surround me. No one will surround me because there's no one righteous. No, he thought there would be righteous people. I think in comparison to God, no one is righteous in their own merit. No one is righteous in comparison to God, and no one of their own merit is going to be righteous. So it's an appeal to the justice of God. Now, verses 3 and 4, let's see what his enemy is doing. What does he say about his enemy? He persecutes me, crushed his life. I don't feel like the life is just pressed out of me. What else does he describe? Yeah, I feel like I'm dwelling in darkness, like those who have been long dead. Now, let's look at that expression, those who have been long dead. I take that, as some have taken it, to imply the dead still exist. If that's the case, which we all know they do, then here we have another Old Testament affirmation. Some think that's only New Testament doctrine. That here we have an Old Testament affirmation that there is life beyond the grave. There are numerous passages that do that, and we've seen several of those in Psalms. I think this is another one of those that implies life beyond the grave. But be that as it may, my spirit is overwhelmed within me. My heart is distressed, he said at verse 4. But then at verse 5 and 6, what does he do? He remembers, I remember days of old. and he meditates on those. I remember better days. Now, if he's fleeing from Absalom, when Absalom was in a right relationship with David, those would be better days, wouldn't they? So when you've got an enemy that used to be your friend is now pursuing you and trying to destroy you, you certainly can remember better days. More about that here in just a moment. I want to get ahead of myself to talk about this quote right here, based on verse 5. Verse 5, I'll remember it days. I meditate on all your works. I muse or ponder the work of your hands. Now, Lupo gave this quote at verse 5. That is an effective way of getting one's bearings. God does not change. His works reveal adequately what an attitude he has toward his people. I like what he said there. You get his point? That is to ponder, just sit back and ponder what God, his works, what he did in the Garden of Eden, what he did in the flood, what he did in saving Noah, what he did in sparing the people out of the land of Egypt, what he did in showing mercy and bringing the manna and the water from the rock, etc. And on down the line we could go. All of that helps me get my bearings because that God that did that is the same God I serve. And that tells me that he has an attitude, an adequate and gracious attitude toward his people. So when I'm in trouble and I feel like nobody cares, God cares because he's the same God that delivered them out of the land of Egypt. This is the same God. And this is the same God that showed mercy and gave them water when they were thirsty and gave them manna when they were hungry. Make sense? I like that quote. I think that captures part of the thought of what's going on in Psalm 143. All right, let's go back now to verse 7 through 12. He makes a plea here for mercy. And so what do you see in verses 1 and 2? Not 1 and 2, 7 and 8. This seems to be quite urgent because he says, answer swiftly, yes. Answer me speedily. And notice at verse 8, part of that is found in this phrase, cause me to hear your loving kindness in the morning. Now that's interesting. In other words, he expected that he probably would get a quick and swift answer from God, and he makes a plea for God's mercy. This is urgent. Absalom, if it be the case, is after me. He's trying to kill me. And so answer me speedily, and I expect, and I'm paraphrasing verse 8, that I will hear in the morning of your loving kindness. And I will hear of your response. I will see you answering my prayer soon. Now, verse 8 and 10, this is interesting. Right in the middle of danger, he asked God to cause him to know something. What does he want him to know? The way I should go. What does that mean? Well, let's get the wording first. Cause me to hear your loving kindness. Cause me to know the way in which I should walk. And then at verse 10, teach me to do your will. Those are parallel phrases, by the way. I think. Absolutely. That doesn't justify him doing anything wrong. You started to say something, Stephen? Yeah, I need wisdom. I need to know the direction to go. I want to do what's right, even though I'm being done wrong. How often, in that context, how often has somebody done us wrong and we think that justifies us doing something we know to be wrong? And yet he's saying, I still want to do what's right. So, cause me to know the way in which I should go. And then verse 9 and 11 and 12, his plea is to deliver me. Look at verse 9, deliver me. Verse 11, revive me for your sake. And then look at verse 12, in your mercy cut off my enemies and destroy all those who afflict my soul, for I am your servant. And so I have troubles. I have a complaint against my enemy. Here's the plea for mercy. I want to do the same thing we did with the last psalm. Perhaps we can identify with this. Here's his problem. He said, I'm persecuted. And you say, well, I'm not persecuted. All that live righteous shall suffer persecution. That's what Paul told Timothy. So is that true? I think so. Persecution just simply means suffering for the cause of what's right. If you suffer for doing what's right, you are being persecuted. Now, the apostles were persecuted by being killed and threatened and put in prison. You may just suffer ridicule, but if you're suffering for doing what's right, that is persecution. That is the chastening of the Lord of Hebrews 12. And so maybe we can identify that. Do you ever feel like the life has just been crushed out of you? That I feel like something has just set on me and just crushed the life out of me. And then he described it as living in darkness. You feel like the light's been turned out on you and you're just living in darkness. And then furthermore, he feels overwhelmed, distressed, and the better days are in the past. You know, I just wish we could go back to better days. Here was his reaction to that. First of all, he made his plea to God. Every one of the Psalms, that's the first thing he does. It's not the last thing that I went and did this and I did that and I did that and I sought help. And then I thought, well, you know what, I might as well talk to God about that. The first thing was he talked to God. Secondly, he pondered God's works. We saw the value of that a moment ago. Then he said, I need to hear of your love, your loving kindness. You see, that helps us through the problems if I know something of God's loving kindness toward me. And I'm reminded of that. Trust God, verse 8. We need to be taught the will of God. Revive me and stop my enemy, was his response. And so there's more to that little psalm perhaps than we thought on the cursory reading of that. Questions, comments on Psalm 143. Practical things you take home with you from Psalm 143. God answers prayer. All right, very good. We need to have that same level of confidence. God will hear and answer prayers. One more. Let's get one more practical lesson. Take home with you. Psalm 143.
I was just thinking, when you talk about being persecuted, if we're living through life and we've not been persecuted, we need to see what we're doing.
All right. Good point. Good point. Psalm 144. What type of psalm do we have? All right. It is a psalm of deliverance. It also, like the other two, is a prayer. It is a psalm written by David. And the point of the psalm is a rescue, a plea for rescue, the Lord being, as I've entitled here, my sustainer. Look at drop down to verse 7, rescue me, and at verse 11, rescue me. It is a plea for the Lord to rescue. The Lord is his sustainer. Now, three things happen here. The Lord is his rock, and here's the plea for deliverance. So very similar to the previous two Psalms. And you say, well, why have you got so many different Psalms? Well, this is the Hebrew songbook. So if you pick out the songbook from your pew and you find the songs, for example, in the invitation section, you say, well, these all say a lot of the same thing about coming and responding. Yeah, that's what they are. Sure. They're the invitation songs. And they all say very similar things, but a little bit different. Same thing here. There's a little bit of variation, different circumstances, but this is a song. Nonetheless, verses 1 to 4, the Lord is my rock, is his point. So we've got 15 verses to get through. One writer made the observation, how many times the psalmist in this psalm uses the word I or me or my. For example, my high tower, my shield, I'm reading it verse 2, who subdues my people under me. And his observation about that was, if your religion doesn't become personal, it's not a good religion at all. Well, that's a good point. This needs to be my God and my refuge and my shield and my portion, etc. Be that as it may, let's move on. Verses 1 and 2, in interest of time, I just want to hit some high points, that the Lord is his rock and the Lord is his high tower and his shield who subdues people under him. So the Lord is my defense and the Lord is my help. Now verses 3 and 4 reminds us of Psalm 8. What's the question? What is man that God would be mindful of him? If God is thinking about man, then man needs to be thinking about God. If God is mindful of man, man needs to be mindful of God. So what is man that he would take knowledge of him? Man is like a breath and his days are like a passing shadow. I think the point of verses 3 and 4 is, in light of verses 1 and 2, the Lord is my help, but any help that God gives me is by his mercy. Does that make sense? Because who am I for God to pay any attention to me? Who am I for God to look down and take notice of me? Who am I that God would give me any help or deliverance? So I think it's a humble statement of if I have anything by way of help, it's by God's mercy. Beginning now at verse 5 is his plea for deliverance. And again, there's a plea for deliverance from his enemy. Who it is, we don't have much insight on this psalm. At least I don't. You may have one. But some have thought it may be a nation. Some think it may be, could be Absalom, could be Saul. Some think that phrases are borrowed from David and attributed to David, and was a much later psalm dealing with an enemy nation in the post-exile period. That's just something to think about. But be that as it may. Verses 5 to 8, deliverance plea from the enemy. Let's see, what do I want to see? Verse 5, bow down your heavens, O Lord, and come down and touch the mountains and make them smoke, and stretch out your hand above. But here's the point I want you to see, verse 7. Rescue me and deliver me out of the great waters from the hand of the foreigners. So there does seem to be some enemy nation that is having some impact, and so deliver me, and it's like I'm in water, and deliver me out of the waters. Look at verse 10. In the middle of that, what's he going to do? He said, the one who gives salvation to kings. We'll look at verse 9. I actually should be. That I will sing a new song to you, O Lord, on 10 harps of strings, etc. I'll sing praises to you, the one who brings salvation, who delivers King David, his servant, from a deadly sword. That should say verses 9 and 10. In other words, when I'm delivered, please deliver me from the foreigner and from the waters. In other words, I feel like I'm drowning and I feel like I'm being invaded, and so deliver me from the hand of my enemy. And when I do, I'm going to sing praises to you. That's the same thing we saw in Psalm 143. Same concept. That's where his focal point is. Now, I'm driving to get to this point right here, if I can, in 12 to 15. David, as a king and as a leader making this plea, closes this psalm describing the people of God as well-blessed and happy people. And so let's get the picture. Beginning at verse 12, how does he describe how blessed the people are? Yes, their sons are like plants that grow up. Their daughters are like pillars. Their barns are full. Their sheep are bringing forth and multiplying. There's tens of thousands in the field. The oxen are well laden. That's a burden you put on the oxen that's pulling the load. Putting that in modern terminology, if trucks are running up and down the highway, that means they're carrying goods. They're selling goods. If the ox is well laden, that means he's transporting goods. Things are going well. The economy is going well. That there be no breaking in or going out, or outcry in the streets, that there's safety. And so the people of God are well blessed. And notice how he ends the psalm, happy are the people who are in such a state. And happy are the people whose God is the Lord. Now, what does that have to do with the rest of the psalm? All right. Trust in God. What else? I'm not looking for one answer. It's more of a thought-provoking question. How would you relate that section to the rest of the psalm? God is my rock. I have an enemy that's out to get me. Please deliver me, and when I am delivered, I will praise you for it. Yeah.
A lot of the Christians, I mean, all the things that David says he's gone through, the cruelty, yet he still remembers those that follow God and bless.
Absolutely, yeah. Good point. Do you think maybe it's a statement of assurance that God is my rock, I rely on my God, I am in trouble, I'm praying for deliverance. I know God's going to answer because I know how well He blesses His people, and happy are the people who have a God like this God. I take it to be a statement of assurance that God hears. Now, He's worded that in other ways in other Psalms. That in the morning, I'm paraphrasing Psalm 143, I expect to hear that you've answered my prayer. But here He's saying, this is how you treat your people, this is how you bless your people, and your people are happy because they have you as their God. I take that to be His statement of assurance that this plea is going to be answered. You will deliver me. I know you will, because I know how well you bless your people. And happy is the person who has you as their God. And I have you as my God, and so I make the plea, and I think it'll be answered. Questions or comments now? Yes, ma'am.
Whenever you don't have God, you don't have anything to reference back to or look forward. If you don't think about Him, you don't know what He's accomplished in the past. You don't know what He's promised in the future. What's happening in the moment is the worst possible thing that can happen to you. But I think with this song, with the other songs, looking back at what God has done and how He's fulfilled His promises, when you're in the midst of trouble, you can pray to Him and you can pour your heart out to Him with what's happening, but ultimately, underlying all of that is who He is, His character, and what He will accomplish.
Very good.
Psalm 33:12.
Okay.
33:12, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. These people He has chosen as His own inheritance.
Good connection. Good connection. Give that again. Psalm 33:12.
33:12.
Psalm 33:12. Good connection. Practical lesson or two.
Does the last part of the psalm answer the question in verse 3? What is man that you regard him? Maybe it isn't anything except based on what God is and who He is. And the people are blessed because God is their Lord.
Very well. Maybe answering that question. Get one practical lesson here. Somebody got one. Something you take home with you from this psalm. All right. We'll end on that note. Psalm 145, 146, 147 next time. Getting close to the end.